Good evening and welcome to another installment on the TOG series. Now tonight we're going to be going over the French connection. No, not the Gene Hackman movie, but the connection between the SVDC and the work in France along very similar lines. Now, it may be distasteful for some of those online, in particular those who like to crow over the fall of France in 1940, that France was a major European military power at the time and was also a preeminent nation in tank design at the era. For what they had in spades with technology and financing, however, they perhaps lacked in almost equal measure as a strategic appreciation of the changing nature of war. Certainly, as we have already touched on, they were not alone in this. Significant elements in the British Army and government were equally trapped in the past, shocked and scared by the idea of another war on the scale or scope of World War I and the slaughter of a whole new generation of men. The French, for their part, would focus incredible efforts on complex casting, well-protected tanks and infantry support, along with just the sort of heavy breakthrough tank Stern and the rest of the SVDC were interested in. The team was to leave England for France on the 24th of November, but for one reason or another they did not set off until the morning of the 25th from London, arriving in Paris just after lunchtime on the 25th and taking up residence at the Hotel Scribe in Paris. The goal was to spend 6 days touring French tank factories, and in particular the plants in Paris Satory, Rueil and Vincennes. On the first day they would meet with Commandant Marchand and Captain Pommelet. Formal work was to begin the next morning with a meeting of the engineers from 3 French firms, all studying individually the question of the chars de fortress. Particular attention was focusing on armour, tank guns, anti-tank devices and diesel engines. The discussions along these lines were to become the afternoon activities for the group, after mornings spent touring the factories and studying the mass production of assault tanks and the Char B in particular. In discussions over the tank guns to breach the 7-foot concrete wall question, the French agreed with Stern. There was no suitable gun in existence to meet his requirement, and thus, rather than reinvent the wheel, the obvious solution was to adapt a gun already known and in use, and it's not hard to see why then that they all agreed on the Char B's 75mm howitzer as an ideal gun selected for the purpose. There was, however, less agreement on the engines. Half of the experts, both English and French, wanted petrol, and the other half of the experts were all in favour of diesel motors. On the 27th, the team were taken to visit the tank school at Satory, where they were treated to a demonstration of the Renault R35, Hotchkiss H35 and a 14-ton design from FCM, along with the Char B and Saumur S35. Without doubt, the star of the day was the Saumur S35, which managed to traverse the muddy conditions, but the team had not been asked to develop a small cavalry tank. Instead, their attention was to focus on the Char B. This vehicle was described the following. The outstanding tank is a medium tank of 33 tons, a beautiful machine, and I was informed that it has taken 10 years to perfect and had cost 2 million francs. On my first meeting in October with Mr. Peter Bennett, I advised him I thought the Char B looked a tank with which we should be emulating. That is from Sir Albert Stern. After this demonstration, the team left for Atelier de Construction de Rouen in the afternoon with the chief designers and examining their designs for a char de fortress. Here it seems the French were almost as interested in the British team and the SVDC was in their work, and the French would make specific requests from them for sample British armour plates for testing against their own armour, and a pair of 400 horsepower diesel engines for which they were willing to pay. That was a little later, however. At the plant, after 3 hours, the team was then taken to Atelier DC Les Molineaux to see yet another French char de fortress and another small tank which was noted to have a Wilson-type transmission. On the 28th, the team were taken to the Hotchkiss factory to witness a mass production tank in operation producing 70 tanks a month, and with a goal to be scaled up to 300 tanks a month by September 1940. The earlier demonstration of tanks at Sattery had been interesting, but there were concerns over the mud. Simply put, it was not muddy enough. In fact, the mud seemed relatively light with hard ground underneath, and the SVDC really wanted to see how these machines worked in deep, heavy mud. The French liaison officer, Captain Pommelet, thus arranged for a new demonstration, more closely simulating heavy, thick mud and showing the performance of the Saumur, Hotchkiss and Char B in this mud, and on a 45-degree slope as well. That was the last day of investigations, and the trip was over on the 29th, but the scheduled return flight was cancelled, so they took the train to Le Havre and crossed to Southampton on the night of the 30th of November, arriving back just after midnight on the 1st of December. The trip had been enlightening and highly successful from the point of view of seeing heavily armoured char de fortress concepts, just the sort of tanks they'd have to consider to meet RBM 17. More than just knowledge, the team gained a box full of plans for not only the Char B, but also the 75mm hull gun and a French petrol electric transmission system. We also get to see from this trip why the Army relented on the turret issue. The hull-mounted 75mm gun was acceptable for attacking fortifications for the time being, in the absence of anything existing to actually do what they wanted, but the recommendation was to pair that hull gun, for which the Army had decided the 60-pounder was out, and they were thinking now of a 4.2-inch howitzer instead, and now as a 75mm French gun with a dedicated anti-tank gun in a turret to break up obstacles. Having made that mental leap, one is now left to wonder what on earth the goal of this hull gun was now going to be, and why bother with it at all. Here then we have an existential crisis, for the Army even at one point thought of sticking that 75mm hull gun in a turret instead, and then realizing that it can't be done, then need to find an alternative piece. That was obviously confusing for the Army, as they are still dilly-dallying around and can't decide what they want. Stern, however, for his part, was left with two important additional corrections to a Char B-esque vehicle to be built along those RBM 17 lines that they were required to build to. Specifically, no air vents on the side, like the Char B, and stiffen the belly plate. He does not mention why air vents on the side, but speculation as to why is not hard. For a start, it improves the manufacture dramatically as the sides can be made up more simply, later even thinking of making them in one piece. It improves protection, perhaps by the vents being seen as a weak spot in protection, and it improves the crossing of wet, muddy terrain whereby water could enter such a vent too easily. And it's probably the last one which is the most important consideration from Stern there. Stiffening the belly, on the other hand, only has one logical purpose: protection from enemy mines. Okay, so we've talked about the initial reason why the team went to France and their basic findings. Let's take a step back for a second and look at a question from the last episode on the TOG series, and Captain Nemo asked about production. Now, we will have more to go with production in the next video, but I need you to know that this is November 1939, and the goal was now to have 1,000 of these RBM-17 type tanks in the hands of the army to be ready for a summer campaign in 1941. Assuming just 3 months to get production started, which frankly would be a phenomenal achievement if they could do it, would leave just 15 months, meaning 66 tanks would need to be produced a month to meet the army's deadline. If it took 6 months, as in production of this new RBM-17 type special tank would not begin until the summer of 1940, then these 1,000 heavy tanks would need to be delivered in just 12 months, meaning 83 tanks a month. If we took 100 tanks a month as the possible limit of capacity for ease of calculation, then that means a 10-month production cycle, and thus it would have to begin in full or no later than by August 1940. Whichever way you cut it, the production demand was enormous, and thus there is no chance at all of meeting that demand with anything other than a tank built to not only the incredibly difficult requirements in RBM-17, but one designed specifically to maximize and simplify manufacture. Think back 1 second to those hull vents on the side of the Char B. Yes, they're going to make manufacture easier. They're also going to meet that crossing terrain issue by stopping the water entering. It is odd then that at exactly this time, while the SVDC were off in France doing valuable research, that the British government issued orders for pilot models of a tank to be called the A-20 from a firm with little experience of such things, and for a vehicle to be built along similar and yet far less taxing requirements than RBM-17, and with a turret. That is where we touch on with production. It was not going to be easy. So now you know what their requirements are. Now you see why the SVDC are just accepting what the army want, need to tweak the design, get it into production while they work on their own. Okay, back to the French. So the team are back in England. That's not going to be the last involvement of the French. In fact, when they were having discussions over armour on the return to the UK, the complaints were now around getting the armour up to 125mm thick to emulate or beat the French, and a desire for cast turrets, which, as we already covered, goes against that speed of manufacture issue. Between the 25th of November and 1st of December 1939, the French were not only looking at the British armour from the team, but for engines as well. So clearly we have both the British and the French having a struggle over what sort of power plant they're going to put in their Char de Fortress, their big old tank. The French Ministry of Munitions would actually request 2 400 or 500 horsepower V-type petrol or diesel engines from the Ministry of Supply in Britain, and the inquiry for that ended up with Stern in January after his return. The French were also interested in any engines of 1,000 horsepower, and there were sketches thus drawn up by Sir Harry Ricardo to suit those requirements. Both of these were V-type engines, with engine design number 1 producing 400 to 500 horsepower at 2,000 RPM, and engine number 2 producing 1,000 horsepower at 2,000 RPM. We will go into engines in much more depth in a dedicated episode because it's very complicated. But I need you to know that because on the 19th of January, Stern wrote to Engineer Militaire Principal Laverotte at Atelier Construction de Rouen in relation to their request for two 400 horsepower diesel engines. Stern offered to supply a pair of these from Davy Paxman & Co. Limited. These engines were already built and ready for use. Those engines would not meet the French demand as they were not powerful enough, as the French already had a 600 horsepower engine, suggesting either the 400 horsepower engine was going to be insufficiently powerful on its own, or perhaps that they needed two because they were going to do some twin engine scheme at 800 horsepower. That's a matter for the French. When Stern found out about the French also having a lead, however, in engines, a 600 horsepower engine, I suspect he was less than pleased. The French were already ahead in design, already ahead in the armour, and already ahead now in engines over this Char de Fortress idea. So this simply spurred work on a 500 horsepower unit for the machine the SVDC are building to replace that already existing 400 horsepower Davy Paxman unit. And whilst that was going on, they'd also be working on a 600 horsepower unit and requested information on what the engines the French were using, which leaves very much open the question of if the French had a nice powerful engine, would the British end up having to use it? And that's very much a possibility. A French military delegation would even eventually tour the wooden mock-up of the design from the SVDC at the end of February 1940. Now that's the vehicle mocked up to meet the Army's demand for RBM-17, but it's also effectively the end of French collaboration on this tank project with the British. It is a matter of pure speculation as to whether that work between the two powers would have ended up with some kind of joint program, given the obvious links between the programs and similar requirements, and clearly both sides sharing information and resources. You could probably argue a case for some Anglo-French idea for a vehicle along the French lines as they had the lead. That would be an interesting bit of thought moving forwards. There's no evidence to suggest that I found, but I think that's an interesting thing to consider. Anyway, that sets the scene for what the team have done. We've already covered the requirements. We've now talked about their research. They've gone to see the experts in France. They've come back armed with a lot of information, a lot of new ideas, and now they're going to get down to work in making that Army's RBM-17 design work. That will be the focus of the next video as they try and get that incredible production demand for that design into the works. And as you can tell from before, they do not have much time in which to get that done. So anyway, that's it for now. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you in due course. Thank you very much. If you like this series on the TOG, or any other vehicles, or other items which I may cover, then please follow FWD Publishing on Facebook and on WordPress, or my author page at andrew.hills@amazon.com. Links are below in the description. There is also a Patreon page as well, if you'd be so kind as to make a donation to help support this channel, my work and my research, and further books. Thank you very much.